Hi all, hope we're staying safe and well. Purpose of today's video is we're going to have a look at a summary of the entirety of Act 1. So we're just going to run through some key ideas, some key quotations, our introductions to our important characters, and then at the end there is going to be a task for you to attempt looking at making a chronology of Act 1, looking at the most important quotations, most important events, most important characters and the most important ideas. So I hope this is really useful. Obviously, if you haven't watched the other videos looking at the key scenes in Act 1, then please go back and watch that first, because obviously that'll help and support your ideas coming forward. Okay, so the first part that we need to consider is the prologue to Romeo and Juliet. So we discussed this in the video. We have the prologue is setting the scene. So for the audience, it's immediately grabbing their attention. We have the fact that there is two households, both alike in dignity, which is an important quotation to be able to remember. We also have the fact that the civil blood is making civil hands unclean. We have the idea of the violence and the aggression that is occurring on the streets of Verona at the moment. We have the fact that there are two star-crossed lovers who take their life. So we have this idea of the lovers who are bound by fate and that we know that they are doomed to die. So that's a really significant part of the prologue. And then we have this idea to now pay attention, the idea that the only thing that can bury their parents' strife is their death. And if the audience now pays attention, they're going to learn about that from the story of Romeo and Juliet. The prologue is there to build up suspense, to set the scene and set the tone of the play, but also to give the audience something to immediately grab their attention, to really invest them in this story so that they know what is going to be occurring next. It's written in the form of a sonnet with the 14 lines, which is traditionally a love poem, but in this case it's something that is unusual. It's preluding death. So it's playing with the idea of a romantic sonnet, but it's not quite in the same way. Okay, so the first scene that we have in the play proper is Act 1, Scene 1, which starts with a violent brawl between the Montagues and the Capulets. This is immediately setting us up for us as an audience that the families are full of a deep and meaningful hatred for each other, and it runs deep from the lowest servant right the way up to the highest lord, and that is demonstrated by the escalation of the fight. Key quotations and key ideas to remember is the idea that I will bite my thumb at them and it will be a disgrace if they bear it. So the idea of disgrace and shame have been a prominent part of the fact that the antagonistic and the conflict between the families is there through the simple act of biting the thumb. We have Benvolio's character, who is more peaceful and more looking to calm the storm, if you like, with part fools, you know not what you do, compared with Tybalt, who wants to escalate the violence. So it's what drawn and talk of peace, I hate the word as I hate hell, all Montagues and thee. Now this is really, really significant quotations for both Benvolio and Tybalt that that you need to know well and be able to understand. So we have this escalating violence. We have the Lord Capulet and Lord Montague arriving with their various partners, and the fight escalates until the prince arrives and decrees that until the next person to break the peace of the streets will be put to death. Okay, so we now have this final decree that the next person to disturb the streets, foreshadowing what's going to happen later on in the play. So Act 1, Scene 1 starts with this idea of violence and the idea of the conflict between the two families, really closely set in that scene. The second part of Act 1, Scene 1 concerns Romeo and how he's feeling at the start of the play. Now, we have a brief discussion between his father, Lord Montague, and Benvolio, his cousin, asking, how have you seen Romeo? Do we know where he is? And Benvolio confesses that he tried to speak to Romeo, but Romeo went away from him, and he let him do that. The his father, Lord Montague, puts across that he is many a morning has he been seen with tears augmenting the fresh morning dew. So many a morning has he been seen in this grove of sycamore trees where he's been crying, adding tears to the dew, and he's adding clouds upon clouds of sighs, which is a really useful quotation to remember as well. Benvolio goes to speak to Romeo and says that hopefully that he'll be able to change his mood and to be able to find out what's wrong with him. Romeo uses a lot of contradictions here at this point. He's trying to describe how he's feeling, and what he's suggesting is that he is feeling bad because of love. He's feeling a sickness because of the love that he has been feeling. So he used lots of contradictory language, such as cold fire, warm ice, like these sort of bright smoke. Lots of contradictory, juxtaposed, oxymoronic ideas about how Romeo is confused, and it's because he's been dumped by his girlfriend Rosaline. So by the end of Act 1, Scene 1, what we have is a scene setting of Romeo is lovesick, and he's confused about love, he's confused about relationships, and he doesn't really know what's going to happen next. And Benvolio suggests that he's going to help him to feel better about himself and about love. Okay, moving on from the end of Act 1, Scene 1 and Romeo's love sickness, we move into Act 1, Scene 2, where we have Juliet's father in deep discussion with Paris, who is a nobleman from Verona. And Paris is seeking to marry Juliet. He's looking to make a match, and now normally, contextually, we would expect Lord Capulet to be really pleased with this. It's a good marriage for his daughter to be making. However, Lord Capulet is a little bit more reluctant to just agree to this straight away. He says, "My daughter is still a stranger in this world," which is quite an interesting one to do. And Paris retorts with, "Younger than her, a happy mother's maid." So we have this sort of sparring between the two of them about how Paris wishes to marry Juliet. Ultimately, Lord Capulet relents and asks Paris to gently woo Juliet, and at a party later that he will set this up so he can speak to Juliet and woo her, so that Juliet has some sort of say in this, some sort of a chance to meet Paris before he agrees to the marriage. So again, this is a setting the scene of what's going to happen further on in the play, where Paris is the match made for Juliet. He's the one who Juliet is supposed to be marrying, and this scene is setting up a lot of different things. First of all, Paris's important role in the play as Juliet's match, but also Lord Capulet's role and how he's actually quite different to what you might expect contextually, and how he's looking out for Juliet and looking out for her interests as well as his own. Okay, and then moving on to Act 1, Scene 3, we have Juliet meeting with the nurse and her mother, Lady Capulet. Now, what we have here is a really interesting dynamic and relationship between Juliet and these two powerful female figures in her life. We have Juliet's mother, who is much more associated with, much more bothered by the social and the financial links that Paris could make by the wedding, by marrying Juliet, but also the nurse, in our contrast, is more bothered about Juliet's personality, more bothered about how Juliet is feeling. For example, Lady Capulet says, very bluntly, "How stands your disposition to be married?" She's very blunt and to the point, asking the questions, whereas the nurse uses more romantic language. She describes Paris as a man of wax, looking at how he is a beautiful figure. He's someone who Juliet could easily fall in love with. So we have these contradictory attitudes towards Juliet, whereas Juliet is... she doesn't immediately agree to this, but she agrees to meet Paris and to see what would happen. She admits that marriage is not an honour that I have dreamt of, but then is willing to go and meet Paris and to see what will happen, and how that will play out for the rest of the play. Okay, so by the end of Act 1, we come to probably the most important scene in the act. We've had all the scenes set in from Shakespeare of the two conflicted families. We've had the brawl on the streets. We've had this proclamation that the next person who disturbs that peace will be struck down, will be executed. We've had the preamble of Juliet's proposal from Paris. We've had her father reluctantly agreeing to let Paris to try and woo her. We've had Juliet's initial reluctance, but then agreeing to meet Paris and see what's going to go on. And the party that we have at the end of Act 1 scene, in Act 1 scene 5, at the end of Act 1, is the party that is intending for Paris to be able to woo Juliet. And actually what happens is the entire opposite of what people were expecting, is that Romeo and his friends sneak into the party, and Juliet and Romeo meet and fall almost immediately and passionately in love. So a few important things to note here. So the attraction between the two is immediate, and it is seen as very perfect. So for example, Romeo's first declaration on seeing Juliet is, "She doth teach the torches to burn bright," that Juliet's a bright light, and that she's one who's creating this brightness around him in the world. So the fact that Juliet is able to teach the torches is a really significant quote. He compares her to a snowy dove, and the rest of the party goes as crows. So we have this interesting metaphor where Juliet is like pure and innocent, like a dove, compared to the trooping of the crows in the rest of the scene. We also have the fact that he sees Juliet as something that's holy. There's lots of religious imagery being used. He describes her as a holy shrine, and he describes himself as sinful. The fact that he would profane, which means make worse, to make sinful, her by touching her with his hand. The fact that he sees her on the hand of Paris and says that she is enriching his hand, making him feel richer. So we have this immediate affection and immediate sort of infatuation from Romeo. This is embodied particularly in his final two lines of his first speech, where he says, "Did my heart love till now, forswear its sight, for I never saw true beauty till this night." The fact that he says that his eyes previously had been lying to him. Now if we contrast this with the Romeo that we know from the start of this act, the transformation is immediate and is compelling. How much he's changed from this lovesick character from scene 1, who doesn't understand what's going on in the world, doesn't understand the ideas of love, and doesn't understand why it's so painful for him. Okay, the second part of the scene, we have Tybalt recognising Romeo. Now, this is foreshadowing what will happen later on in the play. We know Tybalt's an aggressive, violent character who's obsessed with hatred for the Montagues. So the fact that he sees Romeo and he recognises his voice, he says that to strike him dead, I would not think it a sin. The fact that he's almost certain to cause violence, and he's held back by Lord Capulet. Lord Capulet tells Tybalt that he will not have him disturbing the party. He says to let him be, and Lord Capulet actually shows the restraint here. Tybalt will not let this slight go unpunished, and he swears revenge on Romeo at some point in the future, again foreshadowing stuff that will happen later on in the play. So when Romeo and Juliet meet and start to speak, the first 14 lines that they say to each other form a perfect sonnet, and we get a sense of completeness and a sense of wholeness, that these two characters who've been apart so far are being brought together in a sense of wholeness and a sense of something that is made perfect, and that is reflected in the fact that they complete each other's lines, and there's an absolute perfect rhyme between what they are saying to each other. Now again, this gives us a sense of these two characters are made for each other. These two characters are destined to be together, and linking back to the prologue, and we talk about star-crossed, the fact that fate is going to bring these two characters together. There's lots of religious imagery here where they play around with the idea of a palmer's kiss, which is the pilgrim's way of greeting each other, which is palm to palm, and the fact that there's used lots of puns on the idea of, okay, so palm to palm is a palmer's kiss, why can't we kiss like normal? And then they do kiss, and they do have that instant attraction to each other. Again, we have that religious imagery. So Romeo talks about how Juliet is taking his sin away from him by kissing him, the fact that she's making him more pure and making him better, if you like, and Juliet plays again on this and talks about him being a good pilgrim, and the fact that he's like on a journey of religious discovery, if you like. So Juliet is using this playful language between the two of them. Now, what we're seeing here is a much more instant attraction than when she was initially told about Paris. There's a much more spark in Juliet, if you like, at this point. So the two characters meet, and the instant attraction is there. There's a real sense of the fact that they are made for each other. Now, the final part of Act 1, Scene 5, we have the realisation of who they are and the mistake that they've now made, and the consequences of what will happen if because they've fallen deeply in love with each other. We have Juliet. Romeo, first of all, saying, my life is in my foe's debt. The fact that he now owes everything to his enemies. The fact that his foes are the people who now can control him because he's fallen so much in Juliet. And Juliet has a similar line in which she says, my only love sprung from my only hate. So the end of Act 1 is this absolute cliffhanger of, we now have these two conflicting families where their two only children have now fallen deeply in love with each other, and what are the consequences of that going to be? And that's the end of Act 1, set it that final cliffhanger of, we don't know what's going to happen next, and hopefully keeping the audience on tenterhooks and wanting to find out what's going to happen to these two lovers. Okay, there are three things I'd like you to have a look at now that we've covered the whole of Act 1. The first of which is to make a timeline of the act. So we're looking at the starting point with the fight, right the way through to the Romeo and Juliet meeting at the party. And what I'd like you to do is to obviously annotate where the different acts are and the action that's happening in each act, in each scene, but also looking at key quotations from each scene. And you can use this video, I can go back and look at the previous videos to see what's going on there, and you can use quotations from that to illustrate it. Look at rising and falling action, look at what's happening, look at which characters are introduced at which point and what we are learning about them, so that by the end you should have a big sheet of paper with, or a computer document, whatever it is you're doing this on, and look at where the action is going, what have we learned in this first act. The second thing I'd like you to do is to have a look at a piece of written work looking at how does Shakespeare set the scene in Act 1. So you can look at this from lots of different angles. You can look at this about introducing characters, or you can look at this about introducing themes and ideas. Look at things like using the prologue and using the Act 1, how do you open the opening scene, what did he do? At least 2 or 3 paragraphs considering how Shakespeare setting the scene for us in Act 1. And the final thing I'd like you to do is, on Google Classroom there is a recall quiz, which is the simple couple of words answers for some quiz questions just to check your understanding of Act 1. Some of it is going to be filling in the gaps with quotations, some of it's going to be about characters, some of it's going to be about relationships and settings between them. So 3 things to do there. First of which is your character, the map of what's happening in Act 1, looking at the different scenes and illustrating with quotations. The second one, a piece of written work looking at how is Shakespeare setting the scene in Act 1, and then finally your recall quiz on Google Classroom. So there's a lot to be getting on with. Stay tuned at the end, we've got today's film recommendation. Okay, for today's film recommendation, I've gone for a Coen Brothers classic, which is The Big Lebowski. Really hard to describe what The Big Lebowski is actually about. Essentially, it's a case of mistaken identity and the shenanigans that follow based on that. It is very, very funny. Worth a rewatch several times just to get all the little slight gags that are in there as well. Really, really good fun. Really, really entertaining. Go and check it out. Next time, we're going to be moving on to look at Act 2. Until then, take care and stay safe.